I'm going to now, for my first trick, I'm going to actually make all of you turn into fuzz, because at that distance I need them, at this distance I don't. So, I'm going to start with an observation here. You can see their birth dates underneath that, and if Kennedy had lived, and the assassination hadn't happened, he'd have turned 102 last May, which is kind of an unlikely thing, especially given what we know from later about his precarious health. But if Oswald had lived, if it hadn't happened that day, he'd have just turned 80 about a month ago. And in my mind, that makes him, in some sense, a contemporary of all of us, even though we're significantly older than that. If he were alive today, then he would be, alive when we are, and that I think that makes it a little bit more of a current story and more impact on our lives than, say, Abraham Lincoln or whoever it was that assassinated Julius Caesar. I forget who it was. There are easy and hard parts to see in everyone, including him, and the hard parts have really sort of hung up a lot of people on explaining him, and they finally kind of throw up their hands and say, well, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a psychologist. That's a little bit different, but I think he's more comprehensible than people tend to think that he might be. In everybody, him included, there are contradictions and there are clashes, and I'll be talking quite a bit about that as we proceed tonight. I wanted to start with this image. This is not an image you often see to kind of characterize Oswald, but to me it's really telling. Do you know this image? This was a card that was in his wallet when he was arrested, and I don't know how clearly you can see it, but it's so clear, it's so phony. He made it himself when he worked in the photo lab, and he conjured up this name for himself, which he did go by, but it's just transparently false. Especially because the selective service system cards didn't have a photograph on them, for instance. So anybody looking at that would say, what is this guy trying to pull on me? And that kind of characterizes his outer self being presented to the world, but kind of transparently, because there was something about his inner self that he wanted people to recognize. And one of the reasons I decided to undertake this project is because most explanations ask the question, well, what was his motive? And people will come up with a few responses to that. If you notice, any time that you read a story of something that seems like a senseless killing or murder or something like that, people say, police don't have a motive yet. And motive is a good question to ask, but I don't think it's complete enough. It's not really wrong, but it just kind of limits you to examining somebody's conscious behavior and immediate things that impel them. And if you think about really understanding someone, you have to look, how did they become the person they are? And that's essentially what my topic is. How did he become the person who ended up being a presidential assassin? Well, let me introduce myself. Here's, by the way, this is kind of what a card would really look like, so it kind of tells you how phonied up it was. So I want to introduce myself a little bit more, because I'm quite sure that none of you have ever heard of me before, or 2 or 3 people in the front row have. And I'll do that in the context of the assassination. So here I am as a high school senior, which is what I was when it happened. In case you're curious, I just played some pickup basketball and broke my ankle doing it, so there's nothing spectacular there. But I was born in the summer of 1946, which makes me in the first wave of the baby boom. And I think more importantly, it puts me as a rough contemporary of his. I'm only about 7 years younger than he is. My life early on was nothing like his. I had an intact family, and our living situations were not as unstable as his, but I grew up in the same times that he did, and that helps me think about some of the cultural things and cultural meanings that would have helped shape him. I'm thinking about the images of masculinity. That turned out to be a very important thing. What is it to be a man? the roles of men and women relative to each other, especially when they were parents. That was very different then. I think about things like the ever-present images of fighting men and soldiers who were thought to be, always thought to be brave, always thought to be, good role models. The military was a popular thing. Growing up in Washington, D.C., it was like half my friends' parents were military officers who'd stayed in after the war. And also it makes me familiar, and many of you probably are too, with some of the things that influenced kids in those days, especially things like comic books and movies and other things, some of the TV shows. And he particularly did sort of immerse himself in those things, and it did more than it did for most of it. Those kind of fantasy images did more than it does for most people to really shape the way he even thought and the way his personality was. So as I mentioned, I was a high school senior when it happened, and it burned into my attention. My memory was flash frozen of the moment that I heard about it, just like so many other people's were. And I kept an interest in it over the years. I call it an intellectual hobby. Because I was interested, but it wasn't really a study. And then toward around the time of the 50th anniversary, it occurred to me that the various literature, the various psychological explanations for him, I found them a little bit lacking. So I said, well, I'll write a paper. And then that morphed into a book-length paper, which is still something I'm working on, but this is drawn from it. Let me start in a way with where I'm going to end up, or with a broad sort of a conclusion. These are quotations from two pieces of literature, which I imagine most of you are familiar with, Moby Dick and The Catcher in the Rye. I can't fully read them, but I know what they say. The first one from Melville really captures basically a dynamic between wanting to live an ordinary life, a safe life that isn't just doesn't get you any notoriety, doesn't make you famous, doesn't constitute adventure, versus basically pursuing the highest truth, the highest goals, even if you die in the process. And I think that was very much what he was about. In fact, I'm using the term the howling infinite toward the end of it to talk about his last days. And then this one's pretty straightforward from The Catcher in the Rye, where, I think anybody can see who knows anything at all about Oswald, how he didn't live humbly for his cause. He was willing to die for it and sacrifice himself. And I want to give you, I'm going to call them stepping stones, as a bit of orientation to help keep things a little bit more grounded here. And I'm going to give you 5 of them. I'm calling them stepping stones because you can think of his life as a turbulent stream, and if you want to really figure out about it, you can't really get in it, go out and be directly in it, but if you can get out on some kind of like boulders or stepping stones, you can study it more closely. And the first one's a little different from the other 4, but I would invite you to think about somebody that you've known in your life or know now who has some kind of similarity to Oswald, who was a marginalized character, who was teased, who was disdainful of others, who was isolated, and either they didn't have many friends, or the friends they had were kind of like similar to them. They kind of went with their own group and everybody said those guys are a bunch of weirdos. And he wasn't part of a group of friends, but the isolation and the aloofness and being alienated from others was very much a part of his life. And if you can think about somebody that you knew along those lines, and what your thoughts have been, what your understandings have been, that might be a little bit of an anchor to help understand him more. And the title is Understanding Lee Oswald as the Assassin of John Kennedy, and what that basically means is that for purposes of what I'm going to say, you need to kind of hold on to that. You don't have to believe it, but if you can hold on to that contingently, then what I'll have to say will probably be more coherent for you. I want to really emphasize this. I am not here to advocate for the sole assassination position. I'm telling you that's where I'm starting from, and I do hold it, but I'm not trying to convince you of it. I'm just trying to say that's my context. And a third stepping stone is to avoid the temptation, which is very strong, to think of his entire life before, anything you find out about him, anything you know about him, in the context of the assassination. You look at a 3-year-old future assassin. Well, he wasn't invariable assassination. He did become one. We have to kind of keep that in mind, but it wasn't an inevitability. And if you can kind of, understand him as a developing kid who had lots of problems, rather than the kid who, is going to be a killer in 20 years, that will help keep things, I think, a little bit more comprehensible and you have a little bit more distance from it. And this is a really important one, is that we have to understand him you have to understand anybody on their own terms, what things mean to them. We're outside observers, we have our own judgments, and most of our judgments about the things that he did or the ways that he thought or the ways he behaved are valid ones, and we can look at him as somebody who was a very troubled man and who was a very dangerous man. But many things I'll be talking about need to be understood from what they meant to him, and that will help us be able to explain some of his actions and some of his thinking. I'm not aiming to forgive him for anything. I'm not aiming to excuse him for anything, just to understand him. Now here's maybe the most important one of the 5, and that is that to understand anyone, this is central to how I'm proceeding here, I'm taking an approach that's called psychodynamic. Any of you here mental health professionals at all? Well, psychodynamic is a kind of an extension of psychoanalytic thinking. And if you go straight to Sigmund Freud when you think psychoanalytic, then that's very limited. A lot has been done in that area, and it's generally come to be called psychodynamic rather than psychoanalytic. And what that has in common more than anything for my purposes, they all have a concept that humans have an unconscious mind, and that it works in a back and forth, a dialectic with our conscious realities and our conscious intentionality. Our society is based really mostly that we are rational beings. The entire concept of the free market is based on that. Democracy is based on that we're free choice-making beings who can rationally analyze situations and deal with them. And there's more to it than that we are rational beings, and we have that capacity, but a lot kind of seeps up from underneath. I can't really go into completely into what these concepts of the unconscious are, and one of the quandaries with it is that it's something by its nature we can't observe. That if it's unconscious, by its very nature, it can't be directly observed. And so we figure these things out by indirect means. And the best I think I can do to kind of anchor this is to mention a couple of analogies. Think about ultraviolet radiation. Except for instruments, we can't detect it. Our eyes don't detect that part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but we detect it in our skin. We detect it in tans. We detect it in the development of vitamin C, I think, that's stimulated by sunlight, and so it's by ultraviolet radiation. So another analogy that might be useful to some people is the analogy of dark matter and dark energy in the universe. It's a known thing, but they know it's there, they know it exists, and they don't know what the hell it is. And so the unconscious is something like that. We know there's something going on there, but we can't get to it too directly. So there's a lot of inference, and there's been a lot of theorizing that's come up, and a lot of my training was that way. And it's a lot of it has come out from actual clinical work that psychoanalysts and others have done with their patients. And one of the things about the unconscious is that there isn't contradiction. If two different states exist, two different beliefs exist, two different drives exist, or maybe many more than two, they don't necessarily contradict each other, but they do conflict, and the unconscious is generally a model of conflict. Okay, so let's start with Lee. I'm having a couple parts. By the way, I'm going to emphasize, for the most part, his early life, his early days, his childhood, and then I'm going to touch on a lot of the in-between times, and the paper that I'm writing for this goes into more detail, but there's some time limits. Plus, I think what I really want to do is examine the last year of his life, and especially with focus the last 5 days of his life when the assassination took place. And I think I have some ideas about his post-assassination behavior and why things happened like they did, and so that will be toward the end. So these are his parents. These are photographs of his parents. It's Marguerite Oswald on the left. Any images you've seen of her are probably more after the assassination, when she was, an older woman and gray-haired and everything. But I think this is even before she met his father. His father, this is the only known picture of him. And everybody starts out with commenting that he died 2 months before Lee was born. And people from that take the next step and think, well, it didn't really matter in Lee's life. And he as a person wasn't present, but as I'll be saying quite a bit more about here shortly, I think he, out of his unconscious imagination, out of his fantasy, out of his needs to have a father-like presence, he conjured something up like that out of his sort of inner imagination because he needed it so intensely. A little bit about his father's history. Krishna Shenoy has helped me discover some things which will be in my paper. It's kind of interesting to know more about him than we basically already do. She came up with his World War I records, and I'm just to summarize that there. He was drafted into the Army, never left the United States, and was only served for a total of 5 months. And the only danger he faced was the camp he was at was struck by the Spanish flu, and he had to very immediately deal with that because the story of that camp was a lot of people were dying there. So he did face danger, and I'm thinking from some other evidence that Marguerite and the two boys did play up his record and presented him as a heroic soldier in World War I to Lee for his understanding. By the way, the father, his full name was Robert Edward Lee Oswald, named directly in furtherance or in following the Civil War general. That was a very common thing. And he named his first biological son, Robert Edward Lee Jr., but he himself on an everyday basis went by Lee. So in a sense, he was Robert, the father of Robert, and Lee, the father of Lee. So there was a certain intended continuity, at least on the part of the people who named him. And one of the things that jumps out for me when thinking about his death is, as you may know, he died suddenly on a Saturday morning mowing the lawn in New Orleans, and his wife Marguerite had him interred later that same day. She didn't hold off on it. In New Orleans, they inter people because of the water levels. It's not exactly a burial. And one of the things that suggests to me is that she was incapable of mourning. She could not handle the strain and stress and the emotional anxieties of mourning her husband. Part of that probably came because her mother died when she was 4, so she had to deal with death and loss of a parent at a very early age. And here she had lost her husband, who she several times characterized as having been the happiest time of her life. And other people verified that he was, a good man, a good father, and a good husband. So I don't think she could handle the loss, and that got transmitted to Lee and the other boys. And one thing that people don't often say is, if you think about it, once he died, there were 3 boys, Lee, just born, and the other brothers, 5 and 7 years old. And that was a household of mourning. The boys had lost their father. It was a household with the need to be mourning their father. And how the boys handled it, I don't know, but that atmosphere probably would have suffused Lee's growing up. And basically, being unable to mourn is the inability to let go of somebody. And the way you let go of somebody in good mourning is you internalize them as a solid entity inside yourself, and you can hold on to them that way. It's kind of a paradoxical thing to do. It's that you let go by holding on. You let go in everyday reality by holding on inside yourself. Is that too esoteric of a concept? Or?
No, right.
I mean, that's kind of, I never actually didn't realize until a day or two that was kind of the concept of the Ravel piece that was playing, is that celebrating somebody and holding them on, in Ravel's case in his music, allows him to less painfully let them go in his life. So Marguerite, if you know anything about her at all, you'll know that she was a people use the term piece of work, which is not that doesn't appear in the clinical literature, but they do make those comments about how just unbelievably goofy or crazy she was, how she acted. I want to give her a little bit of a break because here she was, suddenly a single mom. They had just gone through the Great Depression. She was a single mom with 3 kids, and the growing up was in the midst of World War II. I mean, Lee was born essentially just as World War II started in Europe, and then came to the United States in great force just a couple of years later. So it wasn't a good environment, and Marguerite was probably overwhelmed. Unfortunately, she didn't handle it very well, and the boys basically communicated to the boys, you guys are such a burden to me, even farmed them out to orphanages and to other places, and basically communicated to them that they weren't wanted, except that at other times, at least with Lee, she communicated to him that he was just so special, so loved, so cared about, her precious little baby and things like that. And I don't remember, probably a lot of you don't remember the book, The Culture of Narcissism from 1979, where it did a lot to introduce the idea of narcissism into our society. And in that, the author Christopher Lasch says, the combination of emotional detachment with attempts to convince the child of his favored position in the family is a good prescription for a narcissistic personality disorder. Because you don't know if you're loved and wanted or if you're hated and repudiated, and you need the love and you need to be wanted and you need the caretaking. At the same time, you feel like sometimes I effusively get it and other times I'm denied it, and that's one of those conflicts. That's a terribly, almost irresolvable conflict without good remediation of it. So here's Marguerite at a little bit later time, and she was, we'll give her a break. She was a single mom, not much money, things like that. But she had shortcomings that made her not for a very effective parent. And all the boys tried to get away from her as soon as they could. They all said that. He even started, Oswald even started his own account of his life, saying that, mentioning the death of his father, the loss of his father. Should I point this over that way, or does it matter? Okay. So here's the 3 boys. It's Lee in the middle. On the left is Robert, and on the right is John Pick, who, as you may know, was a half-brother to Lee and Robert. Marguerite had been married before, but he was raised more or less in the family. He was there from a young age and was raised more or less as just a complete member of the 3 boys. So to get into the psyche of it all, I came up with a term called the lost father of his mind. And I sort of already alluded to that he badly needed a father, badly needed a male presence, badly needed some kind of a counter force to what he was getting from Marguerite. And he was a kid who had basically a good imagination already. And I think what he did out of accounts of his father that he probably got from his brothers or from the family or from people around, I think he essentially conjured up a father in his own mind because he needed it so much. Unfortunately, he was conjuring it up out of the mind of a 12-month-old or 3-year-old or something that isn't very developed, and the idea of a father is kind of created inside you. And that becomes a lifelong pattern with him to to understand reality as that which he creates inside himself, and he tended to over-rely on his inner fantasies and his inner thoughts of what things were, and to escape into those a lot, and he never was able to develop beyond that. And the biggest thing I think that was lacking in his mother was somebody who was empathic with him, who understood him and kind of communicated back and forth with him as he was an infant and a young child, that she would take care of him and she was protective. And there's a lot of other things that go on in empathy that get a little farther clinically deep. And but I think most of you know what empathy is. It goes well beyond the idea of feeling sorry or sympathy, having sympathy for someone. It has to do with tuning into them psychologically, and she just wasn't capable of that. And any developing child needs one or more parents or one or more people who can provide that for them, because they're helpless and lost in the world in terms of their own ability to figure things out. So here is the later days of Lee Oswald's youth. I'm calling it Fathers Lost and Fathers Found because, as I said, he lost his real father, so he conjured one up and was able to get some comfort out of that. Plus, I'm sure his brothers told him a lot about their father, so he had that kind of an image, but an image created by young boys, because the other boys were only a few years older than he was. I also, at one point, I can't really go into it here, but in my paper, I speak about them all as half orphans, because Marguerite, for instance, had just one parent, and they had just one parent, and they were sent to an orphanage. The boys were sent to literally to an orphanage and to other places, so probably thought of themselves as not really connected to a family, yet they had one parent, so I'm calling that half orphans. And also the general heroic figures of his youth being coinciding with World War II and all the recruiting posters and the images and the other things that were common then and were pretty much everywhere. I think that created him in a model that a male and a man was strong, was dangerous, but was a fighting man, was an admired soldier, and an affinity for the military, for being a soldier, later took over as a strong part of his life. And he indulged a lot in comic books, TV and radio, and other fantasy outlets, which probably seemed more real to him in some ways than what was going on around him. And that will come up a little bit later. His identification with fighting men and soldiers, because that continued after the war too. I mean, many of the heroic figures in the movies and things like that. Comic books were heavily war comics, and the movies were a lot about brave soldiers, and they were always presented in a good and admirable light and something to be emulated. So developmentally, I see him as his level of development never proceeded beyond being stuck at a kind of a level of a narcissist. And I'm not necessarily saying that as a personality disorder, but just the kind of developmental things that happen for a narcissist. And you've probably known a lot of people that are termed that. The really crucial thing to think about narcissism is that all of the inflation, all of the grandiosity, all of the powerfulness that's projected is complete compensation for an unconscious opposite of those things. Unconsciously, they feel worthless. They feel even not deserving to live. They feel a burden on other people, which all of these things he was led to make. And there's one trend in the literature that it's called shame, the underside of narcissism, which is, and shame, as you probably know, guilt is feeling bad for something that you've done. Shame is feeling bad for what you are. And that's very much the everyday reality, and I think we can see that a lot in Lee as we move along. I found a good line in the book Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. One character speaks to another and says, "What's wrong with you is wrong all the way through you." So it's basically, it's very much shapes the entire person. we think of people as full of themselves, but it's actually an emptiness of the self that they're compensating for. And you can see how if somebody like that feels like they're being talked down or criticized or anything like that, they very quickly become defensive, and they project outward a lot of their inner anger and say, "No, it's your fault. You're the weak one. You're the worthless one, and I'm wonderful," because they can't process the inner feelings that come up. They have to keep them suppressed. So this picture, I'm using it here to illustrate the grandiosity of narcissism. This was a common ads and like it were common ads that Lee would have had to have seen, because they're in almost every comic book that I read when I was younger. So here's a comic book size version of it. It's the same image there. And Lee, if he didn't literally see this still is the image of maleness and manliness and strength. And I mean, this whole line of advertisements was about not being bullied. And I think the best way I can kind of describe the inner life of a narcissist is through the song by The Who called Behind Blue Eyes. I don't know how many are familiar with it. You probably heard it, and I would recommend that you listen to it. But even though it's a piece of rock music, Peter Townshend, who wrote it, is a poet, and he's a musician, and poets and musicians have told us many things about the human psyche. We can't play it because of the copyright, but let me speak the words. The first part is an amplified acoustic guitar. No one knows what it's like to be the bad man, to be the sad man behind blue eyes. No one knows what it's like to be hated, to be fated to telling only lies. And there's a chorus here. But my dreams, they aren't as empty as my conscience seems to be. I have hours only lonely. My love is vengeance that's never free. You can think of this as the unconscious mind of Lee Oswald describing him to us, something he wasn't aware of. But his behind blue eyes, of course, means a very acceptable and maybe even admired exterior self. And then the inside life is very different. And people, here it's been put into verse. The next verse, still acoustic. No one knows what it's like to feel these feelings like I do, isolated. And I blame you. And that's the way they say it in the song. They say it very angrily. No one bites back as hard on their anger. None of my pain and woe can show through. And then the same chorus. But my dreams, they aren't as empty as my conscience seems to be. I have hours only lonely. My love is vengeance that's never free. That vengeance is never free. I mean, I saw this song as describing that well before I applied it to Lee Oswald. But to me, that's an absolutely riveting line, that people's love and vengeance, if they've had inadequate development, narcissistic development, they can't always tell the difference, and they'll also have loving and vengeful feelings against the same person, and then they extend those into the wider world. And the next part of the song moves into amplified electronic instruments. If we'd played it, I probably would have kept that part out anyway, because it's a little bit too Roger Daltrey-ish to me, strutting around the stage and looking for excuses to tear his shirt off and impress everybody. But the words are good. When my fist clenches, crack it open before I use it and lose my cool. When I smile, tell me some bad news before I laugh and act like a fool. You can see the change. When it went to electronic, he's also basically asking for help, the person speaking these lines.
Wasn't Pete Townsend a child molester?
That's a little digressive, but this is somebody who's written by somebody who knows pathology, who knows about pathology. The next line, still electronic. If I swallow anything evil, put your fingers down my throat, and if I shiver, please give me a blanket. Keep me warm, let me wear your coat. Pleading for the kind of help. And these are all metaphorical things that basically says, help me, take care of me. I need comforting. I can't do it on myself because my inner life is so such a spinning chasm. And then at the end it goes back briefly to acoustic, and then they repeat the first verse. No one knows what it's like to be the bad man, to be the sad man behind blue eyes. I think there's been other covers of these, and they have other words to them, but this is from that. And this is not. I'll refer a little bit later to Charles Atlas as more of a role model. This is like an inflated self that I'm using this for. So when Lee was about 5, his mother met and ultimately married this fellow, Edwin Ekdahl. And by most accounts, he was a good guy. He really liked the kids really liked him. He even wanted to adopt them, but Marguerite wouldn't put up with it. And their marriage was very tempestuous. I'm not sure Marguerite had relationships with anybody that weren't tempestuous after fairly early on. And she almost sought that out to unsettle and scramble people's lives. But he was around, very, very admired, very desired by the boys. He might not have been entirely blameless, because apparently he did do a bit of philandering in that. But they divorced, and Lee very much wanted him to stay and be his father. And when he left, it's not recorded how Lee reacted, but it probably was not something that he thought, well, that's over with, so what? Yeah, shortly after the divorce, actually. He died in, I think, 1953.
He wasn't alive for the assassination.
No, he wasn't, and I've never found anything that confirms that Lee even knew that he had died. That's something I'd like to know. If you don't mind, there will be a Q&A at the end, and Steve, there's some cards for you, so if you do it that way, I'd appreciate it. So I'm not going to say much about his intellect and his grades, because this is a part I'm condensing quite a bit. But he had apparently slightly above average intellectual capacity, and that becomes very important because he later kind of portrayed himself to the rest of the world as an enlightened and very highly qualified Marxist intellectual. Can't say much about dyslexia, but it's an important thing. The main context I'd put that in is that it was probably a major source of shame for him to have so much difficulty with generating language. So when Lee was actually this is probably the root of all his pathology here. It's his haircut. It probably all traces back to that, and we can stop and go have some more wine or something. But this look, he was known for having a smirk, and almost everybody knows it. This look creeps me out a little bit because it reminds me of kids when I was around that age who were always up to no good. They were always scheming. They were always a little bit dangerous. I fortunately was, large enough not to be bullied, but these are the kind of kids that, bullied other kids and would pick on them, and that to me is giving away a lot of that tendency on his part. So this is actually before his move to New York. So I'm going to skim through this. As he had for his entire life up to this point, he moved and moved and moved and changed places, had to adapt to new environments, new schools, things like that. One upside of that might have been that it gave him a capacity to be a little bit more adaptable because he's had to do it so many times in his life. And he did show that he was pretty adaptable to things like, going to the Soviet Union, a completely different culture. But it mostly was a kind of sliced him up, basically, psychologically. His brothers had been important to him, but by this time in his life, they were older, and they had both, basically, as they admitted with no hesitation at all, they got the hell out of Dodge because of Marguerite, and they wanted to get away from her, and they joined in Robert's case, the Marines, and John Pick's case, the Coast Guard. All right, so this is the time of his life when Marguerite up and grabbed him and moved to New York, and they showed up at John Pick's apartment, which was actually his wife's mother's apartment. A young wife, only 18 years old. They had a new baby, and Marguerite said, John Pick said, "Oh, great, you're here for a visit." And Marguerite basically said, No, you're going to put us up. That's your family, and you're going to put us up. And that caused a great deal of friction between them. There was even an incident where Lee pulled a knife and threatened John Pick's wife, whose name incidentally was Margaret. Whether that means anything or not, I don't know, but similar to Marguerite. This all happened at a time of his life where he was starting to develop as an adolescent. The way his mother put it about him, he's developing down there. And she was that euphemistic about it. But you can even see here, I think he was 14 or so when this picture was taken. You can see he looks more like an adolescent. And he's becoming more aggressive and defiant, according to Marguerite and to others. And one of the things that his schooling, that despite all of the different schools and places he had attended, he'd actually had fairly good attendance record and fairly good grades. Nothing remarkable, but nothing particularly problematic. And when they put him in school in New York City, that changed, that plummeted, and he became a chronic truant from school. And that led to him being arrested by the truant officer. I think he was arrested at the Bronx Zoo, where this is. He took a lot of refuge at the Bronx Zoo and in riding the subway cars for hours, where he could, I guess, get some stimulus and but also be alone. Many kids with disturbances, I mean, we all like animals, but many kids with disturbances will relate much better to animals than they will to people, and it's a nice refuge for them. That's not to say if you have a cat that there's something wrong with you. I have 2 cats and 2 dogs and a parakeet. I came up with a comment on this picture, because he was always kind of cooped up and kind of hidden off on his own, and I thought, well, maybe he felt better to be on the other side of the walls for this one. Maybe that, at least metaphorically, that can kind of capture him to an extent. So he was excessively truant, got arrested for it, and he was taken to a place called Youth House for a psychological evaluation. I still don't know why they took him to Youth House, because the population there, as they describe it, was they were like gang members and even, I think, murderers and robbers and things like that, and he was a truant from school. So I don't know, but in any case, he was there. They held him for 3 weeks and did a lot of psychological evaluation on him. And I'm not going to actually go into those results very much, because I'm saying a lot of the same things here, and of course then those evaluation results actually inform a lot what I'm saying. But what really stands out for me is he had an interview with a social worker named Evelyn. It was Evelyn Strickman at the time. It was Evelyn Siegel later when she testified. And she seemed to really reach Oswald. She wrote up her interview. And what stands out for me, I've worked with teenagers, and I work with teenagers in residential homes. And basically, if you're a therapist or mental health professional and you sit down with a teenager, you consider it progress when they only go like that. They're typically defiant, very resistant, don't want to have anything to do with you. I had a guy I worked with for several months that just came in every session and just fell asleep and was passively aggressive. But he later, I recognized that as him trying to gain a measure of comfort, and he'd had a pretty rough life. But Lee opened up to Evelyn Strickman. That really stands out for me. He told her a lot, even though a couple times he said this much and no more, but he really said a lot to her about himself. And that tells me that he was probably a pretty good therapy candidate. And this is one place that I want to kind of observe that if things had gone slightly differently in his life, in other words, if he had undertaken a course of therapy, he wouldn't have ended up, an admired citizen and the president of the PTA or anything, but he probably wouldn't have become a killer. He would have had that much diversion of his development that probably, there's no way to say that for sure, but I think he could have really been helped and really gotten more sense of himself. But Marguerite said, we're out of here, we're going back to New Orleans. So he never had the therapy. One of the things that happened while he was in New York City, and this is pretty well known about him, is right after he got out of youth house, he was, I guess, wandering the streets of New York, and people have recreated what happened. We don't know exactly, but he later said that when he was handed a pamphlet on Mother's Day by a group that was advocating to save the Rosenbergs, who had been condemned as atomic spies. It was a husband and wife team, and he dated that as when he became interested in communism, because that's something that they had embraced. And I actually had meant to put in a slide of the Rosenbergs here, and I left it out. I thought I sent you. I think they became a kind of a role model for him, even if it was pretty deeply in his memory at the time, because I think he probably thought of them as a kind of an idealized set of parents for him. They were true to their cause. They were people who were widely admired by some people, some elements of the society, particularly leftist homes. I won't, because it's what they meant in his life. They were executed shortly after that, but his reaction to it is not known. But what happened, an image got implanted in his mind of people who were willing to die for their beliefs. I think that's what they represented to him, and that's what he ended up doing. Arguably ended up doing. All right, so they went back home to Texas shortly after this. Marguerite cut and ran. And so he went back to some of the same patterns of moves in different schools and not many friends. He did have one guy that came kind of the closest to qualifying as a friend during that time. He was more like a sympathetic guy who sort of took him under his wing for a while. I think in a way, his best friends during that time were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, because he really took a powerful interest in communism and claimed to have read all their works, and didn't digest very much of them. But he needed peers. He needed people to kind of identify with and think of as in simpatico with him, as endorsing him as a person, because of their beliefs and their willingness to stand up for them. So I'm going to transition to the next section now, and this is a good time to introduce a notion that I think is very important to understanding him, and that's a notion that he felt he had a destiny. He felt that something about him, he was so grandiose that the universe had plans for him. He wouldn't have necessarily put it in those terms, but his inner belief was, I'm so amazing, I'm so wonderful, that I must be destined for good things. And much of the rest of his life is a search to make those things happen and expect that they would. It's kind of the American dream in a way. He said he didn't believe in the beliefs of America, but America is that you control your own destiny, and if you work hard, you will fulfill it. But Marxist Lee Oswald entered the Marines, and everybody says, "What a horrible, amazing contradiction! A Marxist, a Marine? Those are oil and water. Those are things that don't mix." And my best understanding of that is that they were both identities for him. He was a teenager. Teenagers work on developing identities, a sense of self. They try out different identities and see what fits. And they reject and some and accept others or amalgamate others. And I think being manly. Remember, I talked about the images of maleness in those times. I think being very manly was an important thing for him to develop. And here's where that Charles Atlas ad probably showed up fairly directly. You probably know that Oswald was not an imposing physical specimen. That wasn't a good thing. That's even now, that's not the greatest thing to be in our society. And back then, if you were, not beyond a certain height and skinny and not very athletic, you were subject to a great deal of ridicule and ostracism. So, but both being a Marxist is a kind of an enhanced masculine identity for the intellect, and being a Marine is an enhanced masculine identity for basically dealing with the world physically and with your image for them. And also joining the Marines may have been a way for him to try to, because he was increasingly dealing with internal aggression, and he may have been trying to redirect it by becoming a fighting man. And also he probably needed the structure of being in something that's as regimented as the Marine Corps can be. I have to admit that one thing that I can't quite figure out about him, there's not much about his attendance in Marine basic training, many records, but he doesn't seem to have had any kind of trouble adapting to it. This is a guy who hated authority, who disliked being told what to do, wasn't a joiner or anything, and yet he apparently went through basic training and did okay. And I can't quite explain it. I may be projecting my own basic training in the Air Force into that my unpleasant experiences. But what really stood out for me then is how much the military was trying to insert themselves into our ego functioning and make it that much more of who we were, and kind of take away ourselves to an extent. I came up with a book. This is actually about basic training in the Marine Corps in World War II, but I thought this wording was really evocative. This is by a guy named Robert Leckie, and again, he actually fought in World War II, but he talked about his basic training beforehand. His book is Helmet for My Pillow. And he says, at boot camp, the making of Marines is a process of surrender. At every turn, at every hour, it seemed, a habit or a preference had to be given up, an adjustment had to be made. Even in the mess hall, we learned that nothing mattered so little as a man's own likes and dislikes. Worst than all this process, it was a process of surrender that was ruthless. And then later on, here's a kind of a poignant thing that he says. He says, Parris Island, Oswald went to basic training in California, but the Marine Corps has and still has a basic training base in Parris Island, South Carolina. And Leckie says, if you're undone in Parris Island, taken apart in those first few weeks, it is at the rifle range that they start to put you together again. And that's obviously a kind of a poignant thing when thinking about Oswald. His overall scores were virtually average. It's kind of interesting that he was unqualified as a swimmer. And what eventually happened is his kind of self-undermining tendencies that come from that shame side, that self-disregarding side of narcissism came out, and he became a very easy target to be ridiculed by other Marines. And this is, I think, shortly after he joined the Marines. And their recruiting slogan, I don't know if it still is now, but for decades it was the Marine Corps builds men. And that would have quite a lot of appeal for somebody who thinks they need to become a very masculine man. So here's later on. This is one of those photographs where it was folded and torn, but I think that's kind of at least metaphorically representative of somebody who had wasn't really well put together and had a couple of different sides to him. So in the Marine Corps, I talked a little bit about his being teased and harangued by his fellow Marines, and one of them said, if he'd only just kind of put up with it and told him to go to hell or something like that, he would have been fine. He'd have been accepted more as a peer. But what they called him because of his name was Ozzy Rabbit. Ozzy Rabbit was, this is that same poster just in physical form. Ozzy Rabbit was am I supposed to hold this up or keep it down? Hold it up, okay. Copyrights. They called him Ozzy Rabbit for obvious reasons, and he was a figure of ridicule and a figure to be harassed, and obviously with his name, that made that pretty easy. What I don't know that he was harassed for, but I can't believe that somebody didn't come up with this, was he was known to be a Marxist in the Marines, and his name was Lee, and there was a very popular live entertainer, actually, who was named Pinky Lee. And Pinky was a common slang for somebody who had Marxist or communist leanings, and his name was Lee. So I don't know if he got that or not, but this is just another way to evoke the kind of harassment that he got, and that couldn't have been helpful for his development. So he decided to go to the Soviet Union. He's hatched his plans during the late time in his Marine Corps. And I thought of the word, go west, young man. Well, Oswald, it was go east, young man, because he went to the Soviet Union. And thought that he would be welcomed with open arms, thought they would say, what a great man you are. We will put you in the highest positions, even if it's just propaganda in our society. And as you all know, that didn't turn out at all, and he got exiled to the provinces. And I don't really have a lot more to go into during that time. But he, I call him a defector with an excess of defects, because that's how everybody found him. The Americans who interviewed him, the Soviets who interviewed him. And that line about an indigestible morsel, that's actually from Norman Mailer. He wrote a book about Oswald, and then he did an interview, and in that interview he said the Soviet attitude toward him was, how can we rid ourselves of this indigestible morsel? So he did, he had pursued some women in he was interviewed by Patricia Johnson, then Macmillan later, and that's when he talked about having discovered communism in that pamphlet. He met and married Marina Oswald, and the rest of their life together was one of sometimes love, sometimes affection, sometimes caring, and a lot of squabbles and a lot of anger toward each other and living apart and things like that. If I read that body language there, that's Marina and Lee and one of her aunts. Those are not three people who are comfortable in each other's presence. But he did have at least have something of a family there that he had renounced. They had a baby while they were there and named it Baby June. That's not a body language of people who are comfortable with each other either. This is the only time you see him in the midst of a group of peers or male friends. And part of it probably was that they thought, you're an interesting guy because you're an American, you're a defector, and we want to know you better. And a lot of it was that the Soviet authorities required them to report on him, and so they were sending back reports about him. So Lee decided to leave, and typically of him, he found the fault that he left in the Soviet Union rather than himself, and blamed them and their failures for his having left. So I'm calling this section, these are three things that were developing in him at that time. I think he sincerely, you kind of mentioned this a little bit last night, Ruth, that I think he sincerely had a yen to be a good family man and provider for his family and a father to his children, and that was a desirable thing for him, if for no other reason than he wanted to compensate for the terrible family life that he had, and maybe even get revenge and show his mother, you screwed up, but look how great I'm doing. And I think that stayed with him, and that was a pull. But he also came up with a plan, having failed spectacularly on his terms in the Soviet Union. He was probably not just upset by it, but internally he was probably just mortified. Like, this is the worst thing that could happen to me. And so, I'm going to try again and come up with another plan. And that's what I'm calling revolutionary in the hoping. This is their children. This is actually after he was dead, but they had a second child later on, born just 5 weeks before Lee died. And this is part of his political activities. This is him giving out pamphlets for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which he decided that he was an important part of and had no real affiliation at all, and they didn't want to have anything to do with him. He contrived to get arrested just on a simple charge of disturbing the peace. But what stands out for me here is that he actually asked to be interviewed by the FBI while he was in jail for disturbing the peace. And it seems pretty clear that he was trying to burnish his credentials as a revolutionary, so dangerous that the FBI would pay attention to it. Very naive, but he actually thought that he could pull that off. Okay, I may be speaking a little bit faster here because I'm running up against some time. So Have Gun Won't Travel. I'm playing on the title of a program that was on. That's just an image of this. This is a cigarette case, but it's the only thing I could find. Some of you may remember it. It was basically a strong man, a hero fighting for justice. He was a gun for hire, but who he hired out to it was people who had been wronged, and he was trying to right the wrongs. And interestingly enough, he even carried a rifle and a pistol and dressed in all black. And he was a white knight. That was part of his symbol. So he would travel. Where I'm saying Oswald was Have Gun Won't Travel, I think he, with that destiny business, he expected the opportunities to come to him because the universe favored him, or some kind of higher powers favored him and would certainly smile on him. So in the case of the Walker attempt and the case of the Kennedy attempt, they basically came to him. Walker lived nearby in Dallas, and Kennedy, of course, you know. During this time, he's back in the U.S., and that's when his rage and anger really starts to show up, really starts to build a lot. That's when he starts beating Marina. That's when he's, very much more disappointed with the world around him. And I think this is when it melted away. The barriers to being a murderer, I think this is when they started to melt away after such a spectacular failure. Internally, with that narcissistic hatred, that shame, and the lack of self-regard and the self-undermining tendencies, I think he started to think about being an assassin in a way that would bring him narcissistic glory, but would also end his life because he wanted to sacrifice himself for good, and because he was so pathetic and so unworthy that he basically wanted to end his own life to end the suffering. It's a kind of a major point that I try to make in my writing. Ruth Payne, in her talk last night, I hope some of you saw it, or if you didn't, we'll see it on the YouTube. You said something that I thought was really interesting. I'm applying it to Walker here, but it applies to JFK. She said he wasn't shooting at JFK, he was shooting at the office. Is that an accurate quote? Yeah. The way I slightly reform that is he wasn't shooting at JFK as a person, he was shooting at JFK for what he represented. And what Walker, the general that he shot at, and JFK represented was something that he thought he would get glory for and admiration if he did pull it off. And to understand the Kennedy attempt, you have to understand the Walker attempt. I didn't expect this, but in your handout there, it was part of Ruth's program last night, is the note he left Marina when he went to make the assassination attempt on Walker. And the last part just really screams out to me that he says, if I'm alive and taken prisoner, here's where you find me. Telling me that the expectation was he wouldn't be alive, or that if he were alive, he'd be taken prisoner, and that's what he wanted. By the way, here's another. This is an image of Walker, who he targeted, and again failed to assassinate. Another spectacular failure to fulfill his destiny. And he didn't find out about it till the next day. But again, that was another narcissistic blow to him that made him more angry at himself and more redouble his efforts to seek the success on terms that he thought would be would be admired by others and make him a great man. So here's the most famous photograph probably of Lee Oswald. And what I want to do is juxtapose this with something that what I'm trying to illustrate by this next photograph is that he had no opportunity or very little opportunity to actually express himself in play as a child. And play is so important to development, not just to learning how to play and be with your friends, but to develop a sense of self. A lot of what happens is that you develop, the literature tends to call it transitional space or intermediate space. And one of the things that means is that impulse doesn't go directly to action. You can develop a symbol system. You can develop intermediate ways to try to control and process things so that they don't just immediately pop out and you don't become impulsive and just do things. And what I want to juxtapose this with is that image of a man who may not have been directly trying to channel the Zorro figure in this, but look how much they resemble one another. Think about, I don't know that he ever literally saw Zorro, but he was everywhere when I was a kid, and probably a lot of you remember. I think he may still be around for a while. And Zorro was a Hispanic liberator who was widely admired by everyone. And he may have been, if he was thinking about Zorro specifically, he may have been associating him with the Hispanic liberator that he saw in Fidel Castro. So one of the things that the Walker attempt did set him up for was that he had kind of a dress rehearsal to pull off an assassination. And one element of that might have been that he sort of knew that he wasn't targeted as a suspect in the Walker attempt, but he might not have known how things were developing, and I think that may have given him a sense that he was living on borrowed time, that he really had to speed things up to reach his destiny, because at any minute he could be, somebody could show up and say, you're under arrest for the attempt on General Walker. It wasn't really happening that way, but he could have well have thought of that. So, but he did have a dress rehearsal and did a lot of planning, bought the weapons and everything for the Walker attempt, which set him up fairly well to be ready when Kennedy suddenly showed up in his life. So let's get to those last days of his life. I'm calling this part of it a wish to be apprehended, and I'm doing the dual meanings of the word apprehended. And one meaning of it is to be understood, for somebody to take an interest in you, to somebody to care about you, for you to interact with, and he'd never had that opportunity. He wanted to be known. That image early on of the draft registration thing that showed his inner identity peering through kind of, to me, can target that. And this is a later than the time we're actually in right now, but I think he's showing that he wants to be understood and seen, and to do so, he needed to be apprehended by being caught for a spectacular event. So I think those two things were really driving him. He knew that Kennedy, at least a couple days before, knew where Kennedy would be. So he had a gun and he didn't need to travel because it was right there. So in his mind, that was probably the cosmos has heard me. They've delivered me an opportunity for my fate, and I can't miss this. This is too good to miss. This is another map that the museum has of the route. Here's where he was living, the rooming house he was living in, and as you know, he was living separately from his family and visiting on weekends, and came up with a rationale for going out, getting the Carcano from the garage and taking it to work the next day. And a lot of people talk about Marina having rejected a reunion with him the night before, and I don't give that as kind of the impetus for him shooting Kennedy, and I don't give that a lot of surveillance, a lot of power, a lot of credence. Because for one thing, he probably went by there not just to pick up the weapon, but also to say goodbye to his family. Because he did value his family. He wanted to be a good family man, but all of the rest of this just pushed that aside completely. And I think he wanted to basically say goodbye without saying it overtly because he couldn't tell them what he was going to do, but he expected to not be around anymore the next day, either to be killed or be captured. And the spat they had, that was nothing unusual. They had that all the time, and I don't think it was at all a major factor in his attempt. So, as I mentioned before, I'm calling the last days of his life the howling infinite, where he really felt like he was going to meet his ultimate destiny, and dying in the process was desirable. I think his plan was a little more specific than that, partly building on what he said in the Walker note: if I'm alive and taken prisoner, I think that means he expected that he could be dead or taken prisoner. And so his two alternatives I think he had in mind were probably, one, to pull off the shooting, be detected for it, and then be accosted immediately by the police and die in a heroic shootout with the police. And that would end his life and seal his glory. That was his second possibility, but I think it was one of his aims that he could do it then. Is come and get me, coppers. You'll never take me alive. That type of thing. Not quite suicide by cop, but I think he was really quite willing to die immediately. Or his preferred plan was to pull off the assassination, be captured, stand trial, spout his glorious theories about things, tell all the world how wonderful Lee Oswald was. And that's why he didn't bother about trying to say anything like when the police questioned him. He didn't try to beat the rap. Everybody says, well, why did he lie like that? It was easily disproved. He knew they had the goods on him. He wanted to be defiant. He wanted to head it off. He wanted to go to trial. He knew would be a major media event. And I think he probably would have walked to the electric chair, and his last words would have been "Viva Fidel," something like that. I think that was one of the ends that he had in sight. And for him, it would be a spectacular end to his life, into the howling infinite. I put this up here because nothing symbolizes better to me the idea that he was ready to move away from his family. So here's this place he shot from. This is kind of the close-in view. And by the way, if you notice, he didn't make any escape plan for when he went there. So he had to either be abysmally stupid or short-sighted or wanted to be caught, and I think it's the latter. So here's the interior of it. Here is the walls he built. Interesting little side story to this. I use voice recognition software a lot, and when I first started working on this project, every time I said Oswald, it interpreted as me saying always walls, and I thought, this software knows something, because that's the kind of guy he was. And here he was, held up behind a wall in a nest, but about to emerge from his nest of being unknown, being a nothing, into eternal glory. That's the view that he had. And here's his escape route in two different forms. That's the map of it, and then here's the Warren Commission. And I think he expected to be captured. I don't think he had any plan for what if he got away. Plus, I think it's an important thing about this is that I don't think he knew that he had actually killed Kennedy. If you think about it, he was a long way from the shot. He didn't have the same angle that Zapruder had. He was, at the time the shot hit, he was recording, holding the recoil of the rifle and working the bolt, and he only had 2/13 of a second to see it. And if he didn't know that he had killed Kennedy, it would have made every failure before pale by comparison. It would have been his life's ambition and dream, and once again he had failed. So he kind of wandered around, basically. He didn't know what to do next. And he was sleep deprived, so he wasn't functioning that well. And who knows what kind of state of mind people have when they just have made a shot at the president, but it probably wasn't the most coherent. And so I think what happened is that at some point he said, okay, I'm going to go get my pistol, and I can still carry out my plan to accost the cops and at least either be arrested and fulfill my original plan, either be killed in a shootout. The encounter with Officer Baker downstairs here and the encounter with Officer Tippett didn't qualify as a place for a shootout. They just weren't glorious enough. It was kind of if he was killed, he'd be killed as a kind of a cheap crook. And when he said, walking away from having shot Tippett, he's quoted as having said, "Poor dumb cop." And I think you can interpret that more as him thinking about himself, but projecting it into the man he had just killed. He wasn't a person capable of empathy, and the fact that he had just killed someone wasn't important to him. He was the one that had the unfortunate thing happen to him, because shooting Tippett like that marked him as a kind of a cheap hood crook rather than a glorious assassin. So he, as you know, that's the site where he killed Tippett. And this is Johnny Brewer, the clerk at the shoe store, who informed the police that he'd run into the Texas Theater. And Hardy is the name of the shoe store he worked at. It's not a label that they put on him saying what a hardy guy you are for turning Oswald in. So you all know what this is and where he was captured there. And here's where I think you can interpret that he was ready for a shootout with the cops, because what did he do when the cops came up to him? He pulled out his gun, stuck it, cops all around him, and tried to fire at Officer McDonald. And surrounded by cops, that would have fit his criteria of defying the cops and dying in a hail of bullets, or what it led to was being arrested. And he kind of fulfilled his plan in being arrested and then starting to play with the minds of the cops and sort of set the groundwork for what I talked about at his possible trial. So Oswald was apprehended. That's kind of what this, and he wanted to be apprehended. He wanted to pursue his fate that way. And so here's another view of that, being apprehended. I don't know what to make of his facial expressions there, but he certainly played, you've seen all seen the tapes, he certainly played it to the hilt as an innocent person, but not to beat the rap, but to be able to game the authorities. This made that not possible. You all know this image. He had entered the Howling Infinite in a very ignominious way, but he never knew it. He was unconscious immediately and died shortly afterward. I guess I just want to end by saying that I hope this has been a helpful element to you to add a degree of understanding, not just to Oswald, but to how the whole thing came off and why it might have happened the way that it did, and that it's a little less mysterious and a little less unapproachable. And in the end, he reached the Howling Infinite, and here's how he told us about himself. Those are his famous words, some years earlier, but he basically said it: a far mean streak of independence brought on by neglect. And that's kind of a core that I've been describing for him. And he thought he was going to attain it and didn't. He was very off base of what would have actually happened. But remember, it's of his mind. In his mind, that's what he thought he was doing, and he thought he was on his way to achieving it. And so, let's stop. I want to show you this.
You did great. You came in under time. If you have questions for Dr. Riddle, if you'll pass them to the end of your rows, we'll go through as many of those as we can in the next few minutes. Gene, have a seat, and we'll talk a minute while we wait for these cards. When we first contacted you about presenting the results of your study, we were doing it after a couple of terrible mass shootings, which seem to happen very, very often in the world we live in today.
More have happened since.
One. I think one happened last week, or maybe two this past week. Is there any insight in looking into the mind of someone like Lee Harvey Oswald? Is there any insight we can draw that we can apply to today to these mass shootings, either in schools or in Walmart parking lots?
Well, I think a lot of people, what they're looking for when they're trying to analyze that is a way to predict that somebody might do that and to be able to head it off. And I don't think, I'm not of the sort of, what do they call it, profile school of psychology that tries to identify those kind of things, but it's defeated every effort to do that. But you will notice that Oswald has a lot of commonalities back and forth. One of the biggest differences between Oswald and the mass shooters is that he had a specific target and a very planned target. And most of them choose their targets either completely at random, like the guy from the Las Vegas hotel, or the people that go to schoolyards and shoot. They target children generically, but not specifically. I happen to know some people who were teachers at Columbine when that happened there, and the shooters went around targeting people more or less at random because it was more of a generic type of thing. So that's a difference, but they certainly have demographic similarities. They're typically young, most often white males who are alienated, who don't have much going on in their lives. And one of the things, and this actually feeds back onto my understanding of Oswald, is they are almost always planning on ending their own lives in the process because they want to destroy themselves as well as the things that they've grown to hate. And talking about that made me think back. I looked up the date of it. It was quite a few years. It was in 1989. And I remember there was a young guy in his 20s that kind of matched the demographics, and it had a pretty uneven and not very gratifying life. And he went to a school in Stockton, California, and he opened fire on a bunch of kids and killed a bunch of them, wounded a lot more. And as a matter of fact, as it turned out, it was the same school he had attended for like first, second, and third grade there. And I remember my first thought when I heard that is that at least it's part of him was trying to kill his own childhood, that he thought somehow he could wipe out his past and the pain of his childhood by killing children. That's what they symbolize for him. You know, they were just objects of manipulation for him. They weren't real people. And then he turned the gun on himself, which they often do. So I haven't studied these mass shootings in any kind of the depth that I have Oswald, so I'm reluctant to go much further in them without having really delved into it. But those are certainly some observations that I have from the point of view of clinical psychology.
You have inspired some really deep and probing questions here. We'll try to get to as many of these as we can. Do you believe Oswald had a pre-existing condition to kill that would have laid dormant but was exacerbated by his military training and experiences?
I think a lot of his life experiences beforehand were, I wouldn't call it, say, predeterminate, but they shaped him. I mean, that's my whole project here, is how did he become a person who was capable of murder? And I think his history, as I went through it, and as I'll go through it in a lot more detail in my paper, it all led to preparing him for that. I just don't think that, I think his military experience was trying to be a man, and he did learn how to shoot very well there. I mean, in Air Force Basic, I learned how to shoot an M16, and so, we were all trained in the military to do that. But I don't think as I said, I don't think he really lost, that he got the disinhibition toward killing until he finally had failed so many times and had so much resentment built up and so much grandiosity built up that he decided to handle the quandary of his internal worthlessness and his external glory by the act that would satisfy both his glory and his self-destruction.
All right, here's another deep one. After Lee's departure from the USSR, did he vacillate in his professed adherence to Soviet ideals, view Kennedy as an opponent to Cuban development along communist lines?
I I didn't get to this part of it, but Kennedy, for him, before the opportunity presented himself 2 days before, was a kind of a distant figure for him. And a lot of people look back and say, well, he liked Kennedy. Why did he kill him? Well, he liked Kennedy before he had any inkling that he would have an assassination attempt. And he liked Kennedy specifically because Kennedy had policies that Lee thought reflected well on his beliefs. That Kennedy believed as he did. He was working for civil rights and stuff. So Kennedy was a kind of not a person who was pursuing policies. He was a narcissistic confirmation of Lee in those beliefs. And then it was very easy for him, once the opportunity came up, to see President Kennedy as an opponent of the Cuban Revolution and somebody who needed to be dealt with. But that was those were sincere political beliefs on Oswald's part, and he did hold them pretty strongly consciously. But if you look at his unconscious life, that was more of a cover story and a rationalization for him to work out the things that I've said. That I've got a reason to kill this guy, and look at all what that will bring me. And it was just kind of torture, and it didn't really have to do that much with Kennedy as a person or as a president. It had to do with Kennedy as a symbol of grandiosity that he could eliminate.
I think this was intended as a challenge to you, but I think it's a valid question nonetheless. How can you psychoanalyze a person that you've never met? How do you account for the impacts of only using secondhand personal accounts that are most likely skewed in some way?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of validity to asking that question. It didn't quite get to it, but there is a professional ethic in clinical psychology and in other mental health professions that says it's unethical to comment on the mental health of somebody you haven't personally examined. It's the Goldwater rule, basically, from people trying to say things about Barry Goldwater. And it's a good rule, but there is an exception there for historical figures. And the reason I think I can do that is because there's a huge amount of evidence, and there's also a huge amount of clinical literature and clinical understandings that have come to be part of me in the 34 years I've been in the field, and for the hundreds of years and the hundreds of writings that clinicians have done, that people do operate under certain conditions. Everybody has an unconscious mind, and you can figure out things about it if you understand those principles, and then look at how that's reflected in their behavior. Look how that's reflected in their thoughts. Look how that's reflected in their emotional lives. In their, for instance, the psychoanalytic understandings of attachment and alienation are very rich, and my God, how could those things be more obvious than in somebody like Oswald, that he didn't have a figure that took care of him when he was young, and he was kind of cut adrift and tried to, basically, for Oswald, what's in here is what's out there, or what's in here is what should be out there. That the world existed as he thought it was, and just the literature and the understandings of psychoanalytic and psychodynamic psychology give me a powerful tool to make those conclusions.
Why was Oswald so composed and calm in the second floor lunchroom when he was confronted by Officer Baker?
He was more composed and calm even before then. I mean, here's a guy who basically very casually and calmly goes out to get the weapon the night before, knowing what it's for. So I think it's because he basically said, my ship has arrived. My destiny is here for me, and this makes me just very focused and very ready to do that. Plus, he was a buttoned-up guy. He could clamp down on his emotions quite a bit if he needed to. I think he came a little unglued right after, because that's one reason I think he didn't expect to be captured. If you read the description of Mary Bledsoe of him on the bus, that he was, she said he was sweating and anxious and everything like that. That's one reason I think that he didn't know that he had, didn't know whether he'd succeeded in killing Kennedy or not. But he was somebody who could be very cold, and very hyper-rational and be controlled within himself if he thought something that was going to be a narcissistic gratification for him was going to happen.
There's a question here about a video clip we actually showed last night during Ruth Payne's program about the midnight press conference where Oswald said he didn't shoot anyone. This question is about in that midnight press conference, Oswald's voice shakes and he trembles slightly in some spots. And the question is, do you make anything of this? Do you think maybe these were feelings of being scared?
There certainly were feelings of uncertainty. What he was uncertain about, I don't know if it was fear or maybe just wondering, well, maybe will things actually turn out the way that I think they are. But beyond that, I'll have to look at that clip again and see what those look like. I'm not saying that it's not there, but I don't remember noticing it.
Should we read too much into little expressions and video clips and things like that? As a psychologist, can you really draw conclusions based on moments like that in time?
No, you put that in a much larger pattern, and you see how these things cohere and fit together, and how the descriptions and understandings of human beings that we have. So if somebody has a smirk, well, that can mean a lot of things. It could just mean something's wrong with their facial nerves. Who knows? But if you put that into the whole context, and I wanted to go back. I meant to say something earlier on about his life. There are lots and lots of people who described his life. I mean, this much knowledge wouldn't have existed if Oswald had lived and stood trial, because there wouldn't have been the massive government investigation into it. And he wouldn't have confessed at trial, but people think the truth that came out in the trial would have been a very narrow legal truth. So we know actually a lot more about him from the hundreds and hundreds of testimonies, and that's the source. My gold standard source, which I didn't find very often, was somebody who had known Oswald personally and who had described him before the assassination, who had made observations about what sort of person he was beforehand. But there's not much of that. I did try to get hold of his brother Robert, but it was too late in Robert's life. But so I relied a lot on what people said, and there's a lot of consistency in how people describe what he was like and what sort of person he was. So you can take one thing and out of context and make too much of it, but if it starts fitting all kinds of patterns, and the jigsaw puzzle starts becoming, a ship rather than a bunch of blue and brown pieces, then you can start saying things that with some confidence.
There are several of these questions that ask specifically about Jack Ruby. Obviously not the subject of your study, and you can't spend 90 minutes dissecting Jack Ruby's life and motivations, but do you have any...
I don't think I want to take on that project.
Do you have any brief, immediate thoughts on Ruby's motivation for stepping into history that in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters?
It's hard to understand Ruby, harder than Oswald, because Ruby had his disturbances were so much at a level of kind of fantastical, and he just had too many features that were too difficult to understand. He was kind of not quite psychotic, but he was just he didn't make a lot of sense in what he said, and you can't trust what he said if it's coming out of La La Land. I do think. Let's see, how did I put this? Let me think about that one. I had a thought about him yesterday, and I wrote it down, but I can't remember what it was. But I haven't looked into to Ruby very much.
We're going to do one more question. I think this is a fitting one to end on. If Lee Harvey Oswald is watching this tonight, presumably at age 80 now, would he view his life as a resounding success beyond his wildest dreams?
I think he'd view his life that he had the opportunity and thought it was going to happen, and never really knew that it didn't happen because he was unconscious suddenly. So he thought he was on his way, and I think as I said, I think he would have viewed it on his terms as that he was successful in gaining eternal glory and also killing his inner life that was so self-punitive.
Well, this has been a fascinating evening and clearly the result of a great deal of diligent research. So we want to thank you for being our guest. Please join me in
Thank
thanking
you very much.
Dr. Gene Riddle.